between discourse structures, structures of society, class, race and so on, and structures of social cognition. And structures of social cognition are usually intermediate. They are an interface. So between society and discourse, between discourse structures and social structures, we need a cognitive interface. And we need it for many reasons, to avoid many problems of monocausality and so on. The fact that everybody in the same social situation suddenly speaks in the same way, and we know it's not true. When I went with my students, both in Amsterdam and in San Diego many years ago, interview about immigration, people in the same neighborhood were not saying all the same things. There was lots of variation. So much so that many of the people say ideology is racist doesn't exist because everybody says is talking in a different way. So there is no one system of. And I said, yes, there is, but you know, you simply have individual variation. You have all kinds of possibilities to do this. So between the social structure and the discourse, there's always, necessarily so, the cognition of that particular speaker and the social cognitions of the groups to which he or she belongs. So this is very important. So context is not a social situation, as we see in many studies in social linguistics and so on and so on. Ethnography of speaking. But it is some kind of construct. It is the participants themselves who construct their own context in one particular situation. The same way you now sitting here, you construct in this particular way what is happening here, the conference, the congress and so on, as some kind of context, and it's different context for each of you. So contexts are not social structures or social situations, but they are personal constructs of these social situations. They are in terms of what psychologists call mental models. So a context is a mental model, and a mental model is a subjective representation, if you like, in episodic memory, but I'm not going to talk a lot about the psychological notion. It's a construct in episodic memory of the social situation. Now, the big advantage of this is that, first of all, it is individually variable. It simply means that in very specific situations, you, at this moment, although you're being a woman and a professor and Spanish and so on, may be more or less relevant than in other situations. It simply depends.
Context is a very, very broad notion, and if you come from different cultural contexts, then the problem gets bigger. I come, in my own identity, I come from a very different cultural context from the cultural context that I work in. So I struggle to understand where I am. So I see the role of context as absolutely essential to whatever you are doing. But to theorize about context is a very, very difficult thing. The tendency is to look at context in sort of a smaller scale because it's easier to understand. But I don't think we can do that. And I cannot separate context from culture because we can describe this context here, but you have a notion of your culture, I have a notion of my culture, and we are going to understand this context through our cultural perspective. Now, how to deal with that theoretically is very, very difficult, and I don't think we have a theory yet.
If we want to study the interactions between immigrant students and native, if you want, autochthon students, or how in classroom some dominance procedures are taking place, I think it's necessary to have an ethnographic approach. You cannot go just to take the interactions and to leave. You have to know how the school is working, how it's run, what happened there, to see more or less what are the relationships between the students, and to have also the views and of the people who is working there. Then not just your views, the views, what are the tensions they have, and then if you spend a time in this school, in one school, then you have a much more broad context, and with this context I think you can analyze better the materials, the books, the law, the regulation.
Contexts are always, in a sense, layered. And I guess that's what I mean when I say that in some ways we can think about stories and conversations as occurring in multiple sites and having different kinds of sort of institutional sort of locations and trajectories. And sometimes they can be the same stories. In a sense, they just continually get reworked and redistributed. So what starts off as at least an account that's ostensibly attributed to workers in a particular factory in a particular place, then become retold at certain kinds of summits and gatherings, and then distributed via various kinds of magazines as accounts of the way the new order is working or should work.
I'd like to completely ban the whole word context from my vocabulary and have the central word being social practice. And because the context still creates a hierarchy between text and context. In a sense, it places the text central, and then there is a context. But if you have social practice, then you have a basic concept that doesn't require you to do that. So to me, social practice is things people do, in all its generality. So you have actors, you have a place, you have time, you have tools, you have sort of a set of analytical concepts like that, and what we call text may play a small or a large role in that. So it could be that. So the text could be a little. It could be social practice. Could be going on a touristic walk, for example, and then there might be one or other kind of text. There might be a book that plans the walk, but there might also be signs in the landscape, and these texts are texts. They have a semiotic shape. Whether they're a road sign, or whether they are basic a sort of road tourist walk thing, but they play a different role in the social practice as a whole. You see what I'm trying to say? And sometimes the social practice is almost all text, like when you watch a television program, although you go out and have coffee, so it has to be part of it as well. Sometimes it's only a small part of it. So then really context, so-called, is far more important. Yet you understand nothing of that little text if you don't see it in context.
One of my own aims had been to produce a theory of language or a theory of meaning which would get beyond the notion of the critical. The critical marks marginality. There is linguistics, and there's a marginal thing called critical linguistics. So I actually wanted to have a theory of language which would do but it would be the mainstream, would incorporate those kinds of things. That, alas, hasn't happened, and it was a kind of an ambitious undertaking. But what I would like now is to have a theory of how we make meanings. We, in the social and in the cultural, make meanings, both outwardly in representation and inwardly in interpretation. That's what I would like. A full account of how that works. Because I work in an educational institution, I think about that both in terms of subject, the constitution of subjectivity, and I think about it also in terms of learning. So I think what I'm doing is kind of akin to what, say, Vygotskians talk about, but from a semiotic perspective. Now, critical discourse analysis, I think, has sort of come. I think it can do what it imagined it would set out to do, and it hasn't managed to kind of move into becoming, into constituting a mainstream theory of meaning making in relation to language. For a start, I think, of course, people have begun to look at images, but the linguistic is still quite dominant in an unspoken and implicit way in critical discourse analysis, and the other is sort of kind of marginal. So in terms of a theory of how meaning is made, I think there is a kind of a problem with that. Well, I just think that the field of meaning is larger than the linguistic alone.
Context it partly to me is it's everything that's there. So it's not just language. It's the people, the environment, and everything that's there. But it's also the interpretation of meaning we give it, right? And in fact, part of the main thing that makes it so hard is we give meaning to everything. So, we give meaning to objects, not just words. And for us, discourse analysts, context is a really fascinating thing because it both exists prior to speaking and is created by speaking, right? And that's one sense of reflexivity, and that's the sense that interests me. As I talk, I create the context. But at the same time, the context is there, and my talk is responding to it. And what makes this a really interesting thing to do and a really difficult thing to do is to capture that. We all know that you can fail in either way. I mean, you can analyze language in such a way that you take the context for granted as if it's just there with no work being done. And that's one way to fail. But another way to fail is that you can analyze the sort of meaning people are making in such a way as that you miss the fact that we can't completely control all context. That goes back to the question of power. Institutions do exist. Other people are there. The big D discourses that were there before us, they're there after us. So capturing this moment in which some things are fixed and some things are being created, and they're interacting with each other is what makes this a really fascinating thing to do. And it's so hard. No one's done it completely correctly. And largely, one good way for people to compare approaches, and not just discourse analysis, but anthropological approaches to language, is to see how they deal with context, how they deal with the issue of context both being there and being created simultaneously.